Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger, and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. For those of you not familiar with the consortium, we are one of 15 fire science exchange networks that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. I mentioned in a previous webinar that in 2017 alone, over 12,000 fire science delivery activities were completed by the Exchange Network, including workshops, field tours, research briefs, and multimedia productions with more than 400,000 participants. I think that's pretty great. So to learn more about the Northwest Fire Science Consortium or to sign up for a monthly newsletter, visit our webpage at northwestfirescience.org. So to avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type that into the chat box. Also, I will be recording the webinar and will archive it on our website and YouTube channels. And you can find both those web addresses in the chat box. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Tom Spies. He's a senior scientist and research forester at the Pacific Northwest Station. And Dr. Emily Jane Davis, assistant professor and extension specialist in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State University. So Tom, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great, thanks.
Okay, good. Yeah, what we'd like to talk about today is a project that we call Go Big or Go Home, which is an effort to look at how we can blend landscape simulation modeling with applications to collaborative restoration. And so we'll be talking about that project. I'll start out talking about some of the mechanics and some of the results of that, and Emily Jane will talk about some of the social dimensions of the effort. So because of where we're set up, I'll have to prompt the slides to be changed. So next slide.
Tom, did you see that change?
No, I haven't seen the slide change yet.
Oh.
Yeah, Carrie, are you still on the waiting slide? I think we can see your screen.
You cannot see my screen?
Yeah, I can see the screen, but I can't see I can see the main title slide, but I can't see the next slide, which is the...
Oh, interesting. Let me forward it again and see if that helps. Would somebody mind just texting in the chat box if they're seeing an outline? No outline. Okay. Just give me 1 second here. Let me just start the slideshow again. And we don't want that. And Tom, what are you seeing now?
Just the same, no change.
Okay. Okay. Oh.
Now we're talking. Getting better.
Okay. Oh, it must have kicked me off. Interesting. Okay, so I apologize for that. Let's get this started. And does that show it okay?
Yeah, it shows the presenter view with the...
Okay. Thank you all for being patient with this. There we go. Let's go ahead and forward that, and there's the outline.
Okay,
great.
So briefly, I'll give a background of the project, talk about a few of the components, talk about some of the results. This is not really a technical presentation. We're not going to go deeply into the results, but we'll give you a few examples. And then how we've communicated some of those results to the stakeholders, and then Emily Jane will take over and talk about some of the lessons learned and some of the social science findings. So, next slide. So the Go Big or Go Home project, which was funded by Oregon State University and the Forest Service, actually grew out of a previous project that we call the Forest People Fire Project. It was a National Science Foundation funded project whose goals were to understand landscapes as a coupled human natural systems, develop an agent-based model to represent those systems, and then engage stakeholders to increase the value of the work. But it was largely focused on developing the model and developing some of the scientific products. Next slide. Just a quick overview of the model. It's what's called an agent-based model. It allows us to represent different landowners or agents in the landscape, in this case Forest Service, BLM, corporate forest owners, and tribes, state of Oregon, family forest owners, homeowners. And then it represents their goals, be they volume targets, wildfire risk reduction, personal utility maximization, or wildfire risk reduction. Next point. It allocates those through something called the spatial management allocator that basically the actions are to cut trees, reduce fuels, or fire-wise homes. Those are the actions the agents can do. It engages the landscape then as a spatially explicit representation of wildfire behavior. We incorporate FLAM map-based modeling, forest succession, housing expansion, and then run the model on a landscape. It's a stochastic model in the sense that fire pops up in a stochastic way, and so you can't just run a single run. You have to run multiple runs to get a sense of the overall behavior. Next slide. This is an example of the model. What you see on the left is the different colors for different disturbances, and we're going to run it here for a few years just to illustrate how things like thinning from below, the big orange and red areas are wildfires that pop up during this individual run. This is for an area near Bend and Sisters, and you can see that we can spatially allocate different forest management actions. Wildfires pop up according to the stochastic rules that are governed by weather streams and behavior of past fires in this landscape. Next slide. So the product of that first project, the Forest People Fire Project, one of the main products was a special issue of a journal called Ecology and Society, and there we published 10 papers representing a number of different aspects, including the wildland-urban interface and homeowners' risk mitigation activities, diversity in forest management actions and how that relates to resilience at the scale of a landscape. We had a major component looking at social networks and how those networks of organizations influence or are related to fire protection and forest restoration activities. And then we certainly used the model in a couple of papers to look at accelerated restoration activities or accelerated wildfire, how that affected a number of forest fire and ecosystem services outcomes. Next slide. So the Go Big and Go Home project grew out of that. That first project, as I said, was emphasizing more of the sort of the science and the research. We did engage with collaboratives somewhat, but in Go Big or Go Home, we really wanted to engage with collaboratives to see if we could facilitate thinking at landscape scales, next point, and determine how scientific research, participatory simulation modeling, and innovations can contribute to the process. It's really a question of, we've developed all the science on the one side of these new simulation models with the goal that they're going to help us think about landscapes. In this case, we really wanted to bring that science into the room with collaboratives to see how we could kind of blend the two. Next slide. So the Go Big or Go Home, I had a couple of key questions. One is, what are the barriers and opportunities for collaborating at landscape scales? Next. Can we use landscape simulation models to help with the process of landscape scale collaboration? Next. And then, how can there be better science engagement in collaboration? So it's not only the model, but just the general process of engaging scientists in the process of landscape restoration with collaboratives. Next slide. The project components for Go Big or Go Home are the following. Next slide. First of all, there was a survey of participants to try to get a sense of what their perceptions of landscapes were, what their goals were, what the trade-offs were that they perceived. An education component where we tried to kind of basically engage them with to try to establish sort of a foundational knowledge of what landscape means and what a model is. Next slide. We then went into a participatory workshop for the stakeholders develop scenarios. Next. And then we ran those scenarios with the models. It came back with several meetings to present the results and discuss the implications with the stakeholders. Next. And then there was a follow-up survey that Emily Jane will talk about later. Next slide. So the key concerns for this collaborative, this is the Deschutes Collaborative on the Deschutes National Forest and the Eastern Cascades of Oregon, were three things. First, does accelerated restoration reduce the area burned in high-severity fire? Does Forest Service restoration increase resilience of forests to natural disturbance? And then how do restoration treatments, forest succession and disturbance combine to influence wildlife habitat? We also looked at a number of other things like carbon and smoke, but this is the questions that the collaborative group was particularly interested in. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, we had a participatory workshop scenario. The participants divided themselves up into groups, each with kind of their favorite values at hand. And so there was a timber production group, a wildlife group, etc. And they each developed their own visions for what this landscape would do given their particular objectives and goals. So, for example, there was a scenario that emphasized timber production, one that emphasized habitat for late several species such as the spotted owl, one that emphasized wildland fire management where the goal was really to try to emphasize protection and reduce risk, and then a fourth one which was sort of an ecologist version of returning the landscape to the historical range of variation based on our understanding of fire history in the area. We also included two other scenarios that weren't necessarily called for by the workshop participants, but they were certainly reference points. One was current management, our best representation of what the Deschutes and surrounding landowners are doing, and then another one where we basically just sort of looked at what if there was no management on the landscape. Not necessarily that this was a scenario that everyone was looking for, but one that was just sort of a reference point. Next slide. So here's one example of a scenario, and then I won't go into details on the others, but this gives you a sense of what one of these scenarios might look like. So the goal that this group came up with was create conditions that facilitate suppression around values at risk, allow wildland fire use, that is, wildfires to burn under managed conditions, elsewhere to support restoration of historical conditions. Next point. And the key differences from the current management scenario is that this doubled the harvest volume, tripled the area of prescribed fire, and doubled fuel treatments for a 25-year period. It was sort of a all hands on deck, let's see if we can't get ahead of the curve. And then after 25 years, harvest levels would return to current levels, and prescribed fire would decrease to double the current levels. After 25 years, the thinking was that the landscape would be set up that would be more possible to allow managed wildfires to burn under favorable weather conditions in defined areas. It also looks across the whole landscape. It doesn't just treat the dry forest, it incorporates some treatment in moist mixed conifer forests as part of the mix. Next slide. So just a few examples, and I'm not going to go into detail again, just to show you a couple. This is where we're looking at two scenarios, current management in black, accelerated restoration in blue. The cumulative area of high severity fire is on the y-axis on the left, and the 50-year simulation. So this is an average of several runs, and you can see over time that the area of high severity fire increases in both, but there's slightly more high severity fire under the current management than there is under the accelerated restoration, which suggests that the treatment effects do have a small effect on the amount of high severity fire, but it's not a large effect. Next point. And so what we found, one of the major findings, was that the amount of high severity fire in a given year was not a good metric of success. And the reason for this are several. One of them is that it's just basically hard to catch somewhat rare large events with fuel treatments across a landscape. While we often think of large high severity fires as being common, they're actually not that common at a large landscape scale. So it's hard for fuel treatments to intercept them over time. Next slide. And the other reason is that there are constraints on the amount of landscape that could be treated. And so if you start out with the federal lands, the green, 100%, and then we constrain it to say, well, we're only going to treat in moist and dry mixed conifer, ponderosa pine, and lodgepole, that reduces the area that could be treated to 64%. And then if we had another constraint, next point, that reduced lower slopes, excluding wilderness, unsuitable roadless areas, no treatment in owl, nesting, and roosting habitat, that reduces the potential to 54%. Next slide. Next point, then if we add some forest structural kinds of constraints on where we might do thinning, tree size would reduce that further. Next point. If we exclude open conditions that already are fairly, maybe not really lend themselves to thinning a prescribed fire, that brings us down to 24%. Keep it going. And if we look at places that haven't been disturbed in the last 14 years, where the fuels maybe aren't really built up, that reduces the potential landscape to be treated to 13%. So this is another reason why field treatment across the landscape may not have a lot of leverage on the occurrence of large high-severity fires. Next point. So these would be constraints in the model. Next point. And then there are areas where there would be what we call preferences, where we're treating for multi-layered canopies next to the WUI, where there's high fire hazard, where there's high basal area, etc. And those are preferences that can be set in the model. Next point. Those are called preferences. Yeah. So here's another look at an outcome from the modeling results. In this case, we're looking at something called the area of resilient forest structure. That is, fairly open stands of larger trees with low surface fuels. Those are sort of the poster child of what we might want to see across a large part of the drier forests of Central Oregon, if we're looking at resilient forest conditions. And you can see that with the next point, with the accelerated restoration, really ramps up the area of that resilient forest structure in the first 25 years, certainly because we're really treating a lot of the landscape. Next point. And the current policy or current management, which is in the black, eventually they converge, because after accelerated restoration kind of ramps things up, it kind of slows down after year 25. They get to about the same level, but there's still a little bit more of the resilient forest structure across the landscape under the accelerated restoration approach. Next slide. So the overall condition of the landscape may be a better metric of success than the occurrence of high severity fire in a given year. Next point. What about some of the wildlife responses? We'll look at what we call winners and losers here. If we look at the spotted owl, we actually don't see a whole lot of difference between the scenarios. The amount of spotted owl habitat under these simulations actually decreases. Next point. And a lot of that decrease in the first 20 years is fire. There's not much difference between the scenarios. But interestingly, then there's an increase, next point, in subsequent parts of the simulation. And these are areas that are not quite owl habitat, that succession has occurred. And in this case, succession is overriding the amount of fire in the landscape. So we've actually seen kind of a bump back up in northern spotted owl habitat. But the bottom line is there's not a whole lot of change over the 50-year period for these two scenarios. Next point. What about something like Pacific martin? That's also a dense forest species. It likes large landscapes. In this case, there's quite a difference in the amount of habitat between the current management, which leaves more martin habitat over time than does accelerated restoration, which is opening the forest up. Next slide. Next point. whereas the white-headed woodpecker shows the opposite result. Accelerated restoration opens up these older pine stands and creates conditions that may be more favored by the white-headed woodpecker than does the current management. So again, and we've got a whole list of species that we looked at. You can see that there's winners and losers depending on which scenarios you look at. Next slide. So those are just a few of the many outputs of the model that came about. What we did then is we tried to boil those down into some key summary messages to stakeholders that we then used to sort of trigger some discussions with them. And so here are some of the key summary messages that we pulled together. One is that fire, it's all about living with fire. It's not about getting rid of fire. It's really attempting to modify the behavior of fire and to recognize that large, high-severity fires will still occur despite our best efforts at the landscape scale. And that means that you really need to focus on creating a fire-adapted community and houses and structures that can withstand fire when it does occur. Next slide. Another key point is getting stands and landscapes ready for fire. That's all about doing treatments across large areas or focusing on particular areas where preparation for fire would occur. We know fire is going to come. We just don't necessarily know when and where, so you have to kind of be prepared in many places. Next slide. And then a key message was what makes a fire-resistant dry forest. This really comes about as a result of the modeling because you really have to input the latest knowledge of from fire science about what constitutes fire-resistant or fire-resilient forest. In this case, it's single canopy layers with low canopy cover, large fire-resistant trees, and low surface fuels. So that's one of the messages that certainly comes out of interacting with the model. Next slide. Another key message was managing fire with fire and machines. We recognize that mechanical treatments are key, but we also recognize that there's no real substitute for fire. The model really showed this quite well when we just did thinning alone without significant prescribed fire. The fire behavior was quite a bit different across the landscapes and across the owners. Some of the owners in this landscape did not use prescribed fire, and the conditions and fire behavior on their landscapes, according to the model, were much different than those who used prescribed fire. Next slide. The key message is also that scaling up is hard to do. Large landscapes are slow to change. They're larger than we often can think. That's a good reason for trying to use a landscape model because it allows us to imagine or to quantitatively evaluate what it takes to ramp up and control the forest conditions across a large landscape, and to acknowledge that wildfires are actually uncommon at a landscape scale and are hard to catch with a fuel treatment. So that's a message of controlling expectations, if you will. On the other hand, next slide, it's important to note that location matters. And if we can't necessarily get the whole landscape to where we want it to be in a few decades, we certainly can focus on certain places in the landscape where there's high value resources. And the modeling results showed that where we treated around road networks and used fuel breaks, or treated across the whole landscape using historical structures, that these sort of patterns of treatment actually had an effect on the spread of large wildfires and had an impact on where you might see high severity fire conditions occurring. Next slide. The other key message, and I think this was something that the stakeholders in the collaborative had some interesting reactions to, was that large landscapes can accommodate many values and disturbances. And what this means is that we found that many of the different scenarios that we implemented, that they came up with, didn't really result in huge differences in some of their values that they were looking at, whether that be timber or fire-resilient forests or recreation, carbon, spotted owls, woodpeckers, whatever. And so the fact that large landscapes are hard to change also means that large landscapes can accommodate lots of different types of actions without necessarily changing the condition across the whole landscape. Next slide. and that there are trade-offs and compatibility. Some things that are one way now might change in the future. Dense forest habitats for owls also benefit carbon, but that comes at a cost of open forests that might be more resilient to fire and elk habitat. And what you might see at a stand-in patch level might be quite different than looked at a landscape scale. Next slide. The other key is that restoration is not just about fire. There's a tremendous amount of interest, of course, in fire, and that motivates a lot of the whole restoration issue. But there are a lot of other benefits that accrue from bringing fire back to the landscape, creating more fire and drought-resilient forests in terms of wildlife, in terms of resilience, in terms of potentially water, other kinds of things. So one of the messages is that restoration activities is not just about fire. And then finally, one of our final key messages is what makes a fire resilient and adapted landscape. It's not just about the conditions on the forest land. It's really the capacity of the community to engage and discuss and talk about values. And it's also about what happens at home sites where really a lot of the flammability issues lie, despite what might be going on in the nearby forest. And then finally, for my part, I'll talk about a few considerations for management and policy that we came about from our work. And one is that landscape scale management is difficult and slow going. It's important to identify key metrics and reasonable expectations for success. Some things like stopping large high severity fires may not be the best outcome, but we can maybe bend the curve on some of those behaviors. Perhaps focus on overall landscape condition and location of treatments rather than the rate of treatment or the total acres treated in a given year. A fourth important key point is the importance of fire as a treatment. There are really no good substitutes for really reducing fire hazard and for some of the ecological benefits of fire. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, recognizing the diverse benefits of restoration treatments that go beyond just some of the fire outcomes. So at this point, I'm going to hand off the show to Emily Jane, who's going to talk about some of the responses of the participants to this whole exercise.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Carrie, you can go ahead to the next slide. So this, this process obviously involved a fair number of people. We were engaging, as Tom said, with the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project, a forest collaborative group on the Deschutes National Forest, and with the Lakeview Stewardship Group active on the Fremont-Wainuma National Forest. As he mentioned at the beginning, we engaged these groups through a series of workshops, and we also engaged them through some social science activities, including several different surveys. Here, what I'm going to talk about is a survey we did of the respondents, or of the participants from those groups after last year, after we were done with our workshops with them. And we have 20 responses from that. We're also going to just share some of our observations and lessons learned about doing this kind of project, because it was a very large, very involved project with a lot of stakeholder interaction. Next. You can go ahead, Carrie. So one of the questions we asked them was to evaluate a variety of statements about participating in this process with us and using the model. These were the statements that we offered up to them in the survey. This was done online and anonymously. So as you can see from there, the scale we used was 1, you strongly disagree with the statement, and 5, you strongly agree. So the statement they agreed the most with was that it did facilitate communication between us and them. And the statement that they agreed with the least was enhance the credibility and accountability of the information. That was a 3.7 out of 5. A variety of other outcomes there as well, in terms of how scientific knowledge was translated and how they talked amongst each other in their groups. Next. These are some of the observations that we made just from our process of interacting with them. And these are just reflect what we saw in the stakeholder dialogue that we were able to observe. One was that some of the seemingly large differences that collaborative stakeholders might have been discussing between different approaches to forest management didn't seem to come out that significant in the wash when they're evaluated at landscape scales. More study on how collaboratives work would be needed, but this might help them in reaching consensus. A lot of them were struck by the possible implications of this for the larger public about the impacts of fire in the landscape, but they felt that there would need to be careful communication, providing a lot of context and caveats, particularly because this is a model, and explaining how that works. And there was some interest in the Deschutes Collaborative, in particular in the collaborative helping communicate those findings. Next. We asked folks responding to the survey to answer a few questions open-ended for us. So these are some of their responses that I'm sharing here. We asked them, what were the most important insights that you got as a result of this process? Many of them were struck by, you can take different approaches, but in the end, it kind of turns out the same on the landscape. Some felt that the scenarios just turned out differently than they would have expected. There were several that said, it seems like we need to be doing treatments at large scales and high intensities. And then there were several comments just that life is complicated, and this is a complicated, forest management is a complicated process. Again, these are just participants' reactions. Other important insights, they felt that seeing their values reflected in these scenarios and getting a chance to talk about them was really important, and it was kind of a good discussion support tool. It kind of helped help participants better share their perspectives amongst each other and with us. We asked, was this relevant to your on-the-ground discussions? Because we really wanted to know if it was applicable. Most of the respondents said yes. They felt like it started conversation, it gave them something to talk about. It provided general trends that could inform decisions. And there was some hope that it might lead to a scaling up or a coarser grain of focus in collaborative dialogue. Next. Others pointed out that this kind of information at the scale might be more relevant to policymakers or those operating at different levels than collaborative members. We had some feedback that the scenarios, such as maybe the no action, which we just put in to learn about what would that be, weren't feasible or reasonable. And then some feedback that maybe we were trying to do a little too much. And we did get one, no, this was not relevant. What were some changes we thought, or they thought, could improve future applications of this project or other projects that are trying to take a similar approach, doing some modeling and interaction with participants? A faster turnaround between the discussions of the modeling and then running scenarios and talking about the outcomes. I'll talk about that more in a minute. We did see some interest in looking at finer scale analysis. Maybe some of the landscapes and the scales being talked about were a bit big and challenging. Wanting less focus on the individual model runs and maybe combining some different scenarios and talking about that at a different scale. And then continuing to refine the user dashboard or the graphics and the way that folks could interact with our results and with our project, that interface there. That process of running the model and designing a interaction with the stakeholders and returning was a bit challenging. So you saw there that they were hoping for more rapid turnaround, but we couldn't run the model scenarios in real time with the stakeholders. We needed to do that work in between sessions. And so a lot of time was actually required at the end to run the model, interact with stakeholders, get input, rerun the model. So all in all, there's still a lot of challenges if you're using a large, complicated tool like this to sort of explore what it tells us, share the results, have that joint learning, and then loop that back around. So that was a challenge for us, as well as just logistically making sure that we were fitting in with their collaborative group processes and able to all go to their meetings and fit in with that. Also, an enduring challenge in science communication is how much detail is desirable. How do you sort of pull out and distill the main messages and make sure those are clear, but also provide all the context and additional information that some people might want. Different people have different learning styles, so they need different levels of information and will ask for different levels of detail. And then there's obviously the idea that the model results might challenge what current assumptions or knowledge that people have. For example, hearing that there may be limited effects of management on the occurrence of large, high-severity fires. How do you feel when you hear that? What do you do with that? Next. Differences in who you're engaging with will drive different approaches to the project. So the two collaboratives we're working with are from different landscapes, and one group met more frequently than the others. So we just had to design different processes to really adapt to their culture and meet up with where they were at. We tried to take the time to understand each group and their work and how they worked and how we could best fit in with that. I'm sure scientists, we can always do better. I think it's also important to remember that the public lands collaboratives that are out there are really common, but they don't capture all stakeholders of public lands that care about and are invested in national forest management. And this project was specifically focused on working with collaboratives as these organized groups. But were there to be an application to work with the larger public, there would need to be more thought put into the process and the interface and how to really capture all of those perspectives. So, the conclusion is really that I think more research and practice will help further refine how you do this kind of project and interact with collaborative landscape scale dialogue, be it in a regularly meeting group of stakeholders or with a larger public that does this. And I will say we did have public outreach activities, and we did do some meetings and interactions with larger groups of stakeholders in the Bend area, but this was primarily focused on forest collaboratives. So we wanted to thank you for your attention today. This was a really cool, large project, and we're still finishing it up. So we hope that you'll have some good questions for us. We encourage you to follow up by looking at our website as well. And then we have several scientific articles and technical briefs that will be coming out over the next few months that will slowly pop up on that website. The technical briefs, there's going to be a series of those that kind of summarize some of the key messages and also what we learned about the process. And those are supposed to be hopefully interesting and accessible to a variety of audiences. So thank you again for your attention today and your patience with our technical difficulties in the beginning, and we look forward to your questions and to some conversation.
Great, thank you to both Tom and EJ, and yes, thank you for standing by us while we dealt with some tough technical difficulties. I'm just going to do a little bit of catch up here and see if there's any questions that have started. And I don't see any that have come in, so take some time to think about if you have a question for Tom or Emily Jane. They're here to answer your questions. They provided a website that you can go to get more information. I do have a question that's come up. Let me see here. This is for Tom, and it's considering the effects of climate change on future fire activity and forest structure. Do you expect the accelerated restoration scenario to have greater impact on fire severity and resilience? Example, larger fires intersecting with treatments?
Yeah, I think that's kind of was our general expectations. Now, the modeling runs that we did for this particular set did not assume, we used a 50-year time frame, so we did not have an increasing climate or increasing amount of fire scenario. We've subsequently run some of those types of scenarios, but even there, we did not see a huge impact of the level of fuel treatments that we were simulating on the occurrence of wildfires. It turns out it takes a fair amount of fire in the landscape for fires to start interacting with each other and to curb or to sort of have a negative feedback on their behavior. So that was a bit of a surprise to me, because we certainly, expect that would happen, and you certainly see that individually. We have many cases in the model where you would see an area that had been treated or an area that had been burned 10 years before, and then a wildfire starts near it and doesn't go very far because it runs into it, and the spread of the fire basically times out from a climate or weather standpoint before it goes very far. So that was a bit of a surprise, but it sort of fits with other studies that show that to really have an effect on fire, there has to be a lot of fire on the landscape.
Thank you for that, Tom. And we have another question, first part, that thanks you for the presentation today. And were there any conversations with collaboratives addressing local capacity to implement treatments under the accelerated restoration scenarios?
Yeah, I think the scenarios were more sort of idealized without concern necessarily of whether they would be practical or be able to be implemented. I think there was general recognition of the capacity of the either agency or from a work standpoint or funding standpoint or smoke standpoint to affect management on the ground. That was clearly recognized. But the scenarios that we looked at were pretty much sort of idealized in the sense that we were assuming that somehow that capacity could be found. Obviously, that's a big concern if you're really thinking about trying to implement one of these scenarios on the ground in a real way. But so that was recognized, but it wasn't a big part of the discussion because we were mainly focused on, well, what would be sort of your idealized treatment scenarios and what would those look like?
Great, thank you. So I don't see any other questions in the chat box. I'll just give it another minute for someone to go ahead. Well, another one just came in as I said that, so let me back up here and see if I can. For EJ, collaborative groups being made up of different types of stakeholders, did you find that participants tended to be made up of people already engaged in forest management, or were there many stakeholders from the general public?
The groups that we engaged with are typically folks already involved in forest management in some way. And yeah, this is pretty common with most forest collaboratives, at least in Oregon, in my experience, is less members of the general public and more potentially have a professional background related to forest management. Mm-hmm. So as I noted in my one of my slides there, collaboratives aren't necessarily a way to access all the views of the public.
Thank you. So this is for either Tom or Emily Jane. Question, we work with communities of landowners to help them plan management activities to reduce fire risk and increase forest health outcomes. Do either of you have any suggestions or takeaways about how these scenario techniques or landscape models could be used with landowner groups, not just the collaboratives?
Do you want to go, or would you?
Yeah, I could start. Yeah, well, yeah, I think there's probably a number of ways that they could be used. One is to just sort of give landowners a sense of where they fit in the bigger landscape. In other words, what are the fuel conditions around them? What actions are considered by the best available fire science to be something that could reduce fire or reduce risk at the home site. So I think they could definitely be used to illustrate that in particular places. This model, we ran it on close to 1 million acres, but it can be drilled down and run on a fairly small area. And it could be used to show that if somebody does some treatment on the edge of their property and a fire comes, that it's quite likely to modify the behavior of that fire. It would take some, you'd need to have sort of a team, a development team and a communication team, or at least a person who was available to kind of come up with interesting and novel communication products for working with the general public. The model itself, as EJ mentioned, is a pretty sophisticated model, and it, in a sense, we'd probably want to keep it more in the background and try to develop simpler types of products for interacting with general landowners.
I agree with what Tom said. I guess I would add that, yeah, it would be helpful to have some coordination with or an extension agent, someone who worked with the group of landowners. It would probably work best if the landowners were committed to regularly attending some meetings and there was a chance to kind of iteratively build knowledge and look at different scenarios. If there was a lot of kind of coming and going, or people came to one meeting and not to another, it would be harder to build collective knowledge and have an experience with that. I think I agree with Tom too that there would need to be more work to make the interface with the model easier for people to understand and then be able to talk about more effectively. That's probably what I would recommend though, is sort of developing a commitment and a process, and then making sure that scientists involved were able to really help communicate the interaction.
Great, thank you. So while we wait for the next question to come in, I just wanted to take a moment to say that the Northwest Fire Science Consortium does offer a variety of opportunities for people to participate in, and hosting these webinars is just one way we accomplish that. And I encourage you, if you have a topic of interest or just something that you want to learn more about, don't hesitate to contact us. You can use the web link at northwestfirescience.org, and there's contact information there. We're always interested to hear from folks like you. And so it doesn't look like there's any other questions coming in. It's been pretty quiet. So I guess we can go ahead and wrap this up. And I just, again, wanted to thank Tom and Emily Jane for taking time out of their schedules to speak to us about this very interesting project. And I'm sure we'll hear more with the reports and other resources. And also, I wanted to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to listen in. We really appreciate that. And this webinar will be archived if you're interested in sharing it or listening in again. If you missed something, go ahead and go to our website. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, Emily Jane. And everybody have yourself a great day.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks, everyone.
You're welcome.